Welcome to Marx 113. My name is Bernard Harcourt, and in the next half hour, I will deliver the full introduction to Marx 113, at which we will reread Marx's thesis on Feuerbach in conversation with Ernst Bloch's commentary on the thesis from his book, The Principle of Hope, and in discussion with the philosopher Étienne Balibar. Why start with Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, you may ask? And how can we actualize this text today in theory and practice? The answer to the first question, in large part, is that it is with the theses on Feuerbach and Ernst Bloch's commentary that Étienne Balibar proposes to begin this year's study of Marx 1313. And Étienne Balibar is one of the finest and most penetrating readers of Marx. At the seminar, Étienne Balibar will explain his reasons for choosing the theses and Bloch's commentary as our entry point into reading Marx today. Let me tell you mine. The content and concepts in Marx's thesis on Feuerbach model the kind of philosophical method and argumentative strategy that would serve us well today to get beyond not the conservative Hegelian idealism that dominated Marx's intellectual milieu at the time, but the present political liberal hegemony that prevents collective cooperation and political action. Marx's philosophical approach of using a popular intermediary who had already shifted ground and created momentum, in his case, Ludwig Feuerbach, using that intermediary to further the shift and stimulate action, is exemplary. On one reading, influenced by Ernst Bloch, as well as by Frederick Engels, Feuerbach's writings had already shifted the prevailing worldview by about 90 degrees. Using that momentum to turn things fully 180 degrees was brilliantly strategic. Marx's approach could serve as an exemplar today to motivate change. But before getting to our present, let me explain how Feuerbach's writings served both as a foil and a springboard for Marx to develop his radical approach. Feuerbach was a pivotal thinker for Marx, who put him on the path of a new materialism, having the standpoint of human society, or socialized humanity, as Marx wrote in thesis number 10. Insofar as Marx turned the Hegelian system on its head and transformed Hegel's idealist march towards rational administrative perfection into a materialist journey towards social, political, and economic change and well-being, Feuerbach contributed to that process of inversion. Feuerbach turned idealist systematicity on its head in order to focus attention on the being of humans, what was called human essence or human nature at the time. Although Feuerbach did not complete that turn to the satisfaction of Marx, Feuerbach launched or pitched a movement that would give Marx momentum. This is reflected well in Marx's letter to Feuerbach, dated August 11th, 1844, in which he introduces himself and his critique of Hegel and expresses admiration for the impact of Feuerbach's writings. He starts the letter, "I'm glad to have an opportunity of assuring you of the great respect and, if I may use the word, love, which I feel for you. Your writings are certainly of greater weight than the whole of contemporary German literature put together," Marx writes to Feuerbach. "In these writings you have provided," he adds, "I don't know whether intentionally, a philosophical basis. You've provided a philosophical basis for socialism, and the communists have immediately understood them in this way." And then he goes on to say, "The German artisans in Paris, i.e. the communists among them, several hundreds, have been having lectures twice a week through the summer on your sources of Christianity, from their secret leaders and have been remarkably responsive. Now, Marx would write extensively about Feuerbach in the months that followed, especially in the manuscript, The German Ideology, which he wrote in 1845 and which remained unpublished at the time. And several years later, in 1888, Frederick Engels published some of Marx's jottings on Feuerbach, which he found in a notebook under the title, well, he published them under the title Thesis on Feuerbach. They were titled Ad Feuerbach. Engels publishes them as the Theses on Feuerbach, and he publishes them as an appendix to his own book from 1888, Ludwig Feuerbach and the Outcome of Classical German Philosophy. Now, his publication of the Theses on Feuerbach has been a source of controversy and commentary since, with the theses themselves entering what Étienne Balibar refers to as the pantheon of emblematic formularies of Western philosophy. And with that, of course, comes the risk of distortions and misreadings or projections. Of course, as well, of excellent commentaries on emblematic formulas. But it's important to recognize that Engels had a project in mind when he published the Theses, possibly to systematize Marx's thought, possibly to solidify his interpretation of historical materialism. And he also had a bit of a project in making Feuerbach so important to Marx. But you get a sense of it from the letter that Marx wrote himself to Feuerbach, and you'll get a sense of it from the commentaries that Engels wrote himself. Now, just to understand Ludwig Feuerbach and his book, The Essence of Christianity, Marx interpreted Feuerbach as having been the first to successfully invert idealist systematicity in that book, The Essence of Christianity, published in 1841. Marx interpreted Feuerbach as having shown that the Christian ideal of God was merely a projection of the material reality of human nature and human perfection. As Ernst Bloch succinctly and elegantly formulated Feuerbach's intervention, he writes, Feuerbach brought religious content from heaven back to man, so that man is not made in the image of God, but God in the image of man. Although presented through the discourse of Christianity, of course, the religious dimension of the essence of Christianity should be understood as merely a vehicle at the time for a philosophical debate over idealism and materialism. It should be understood as a philosophical debate in the same way in which the religious content of the medieval scholastic debates was the language in which thinkers in the Middle Ages debated what we would consider to be political questions today. Questions of truth, of epistemology, of nominalism, of authority, etc. The context of Feuerbach's intervention was entirely religious. But what he accomplished was to ground a materialism based on human capabilities, such as rationality, will, power, and love. Feuerbach was explicit about the operation of inversion. In fact, he used that metaphor of inversion himself overtly in The Essence of Christianity, where he wrote, for instance, that which in religion holds the first place, namely God, is, as we have shown, in itself and according to truth, the second, for it is only the nature of man regarded objectively, and that which to religion is the second, namely man, must therefore be constituted and declared the first. Feuerbach encapsulated this inversion in succinct statements, such as divine wisdom is human wisdom, or the secret of theology is anthropology. Now, let's turn to the reception of Feuerbach by Marx and Engels. Feuerbach's operation of inversion was exemplary for Marx along a number of dimensions. First, insofar as it managed to critique, deconstruct, and reconstruct a whole totalizing, systematic, idealist structure. Deconstructing Christianity for Feuerbach, for Marx it would be Hegelian idealism. Second, insofar as it showed idealism to be fundamentally material. And third, because Feuerbach did not complete the operation or take it to its logical conclusion. So there was more to do. As Marx wrote in the fourth thesis, Feuerbach overlooks the fact that after completing this work, the chief thing still remains to be done. So Feuerbach was a linchpin because of the hegemonic role of German Hegelian idealism at the time. And it's important to understand. Marx understood Feuerbach to be a can opener who could lead thinkers who had been raised by, steeped in, shaped by the dominant way of thinking, which was Hegelian idealism. A can opener that could lead these thinkers to become instead materialist and focused on the perfection of material well-being, and to do so through a logical process, a philosophically rigorous process. Marx also felt that it operated perfectly among the French working class because of the newfound irreligiosity, he wrote, and this was from his letter to Feuerbach, an irreligiosity of men regarding themselves as men that has descended to the French proletariat. Now, the impact of Feuerbach on Marx, I think clearly you can hear it in Frederick Engels' recounting in real time, 1888, of what Feuerbach represented to thinkers at that moment. Again, this is in Engels' book, Ludwig Feuerbach and the Outcome of Classical German Philosophy. And he writes there that Feuerbach influenced Marx and him, quote, more than any other post-Hegelian philosopher. So this was during the mid-1840s, a time that Engels described as our period of storm and stress, the period of Germany's preparation for the revolution of 1848. Feuerbach's book, The Essence of Christianity, caused an intellectual earthquake in Engels' intellectual milieu. Engels writes, with one blow, it pulverized the contradiction, in that without circumlocutions, it placed materialism on the throne again. Nature exists independently of all philosophy. It is the foundation upon which we human beings ourselves, product of nature, have grown up. The spell was broken, Engels writes. The system was exploded and cast aside, and the contradiction, shown to exist only in our imagination, was dissolved. One must himself have experienced the liberating effect of this book to get an idea of it, he writes. Enthusiasm was general. We all became at once Feuerbachians. Now, the momentum clearly must have felt dizzying to Engels and perhaps to Marx. And the intellectual context helps explain why. Let's look a little bit at that intellectual context, circa 1842 to 1845. In the early 1840s, Marx and Engels were living and working in an intellectual milieu dominated by a conservative Hegelian worldview. Although Hegel had passed away in 1831, his philosophical outlook continued to prevail through conservative thinkers known as right Hegelians, such as Heinrich Leo and Leopold von Henning, thinkers who are largely unknown today. This form of conservative Hegelian idealism defended the idea that Prussian bureaucratic rationalism and authority were the optimal form of political governance and the climax of historical process, that rational administration of social and political life in the manner of enlightened despotism was the culmination of a Hegelian learning process, that this Hegelian learning process had both a historical dimension as well as a dimension of human consciousness, maturing to the point of absolute rationality, and that the Hegelian worldview served to legitimize the Prussian state at the time. In effect, the Hegelian system justified the status quo in Germany. Frederick Engels would describe this hegemonic, conservative, Hegelian idealist worldview in the following terms. Quote, "This state is rational. It corresponds to reason insofar as it is necessary. And if it nevertheless appears to us to be evil, but still, in spite of its evil character, continues to exist, then the evil character of the government is justified and explained by the corresponding evil character of its subjects. The Prussians of that day had the government that they deserved." Unquote. Of course, the idea of a learning process that created absolute reason elided completely the domestic exploitation of labor, the subservience of women and household work, the brutality and conquest of colonialism and imperialism, and the effects on the environment, among other things. What was so remarkable was how systematic and totalizing the received Hegelian worldview could be at the same time that it ignored whole swaths of human experience. Now, Marx and Engels would try to salvage something from the Hegelian system, specifically the Hegelian dialectic. So the idea was not to throw out everything, but to save the baby from the bathwater. Marx attributed the worldview to the reception of Hegel at the time, not to the logic of Hegel's argument or dialectical method. And rather than discard the dialectical method, Marx drew on the Hegelian dialectic to suggest that the method itself could lead to quite an opposite conclusion. In this sense, Marx would use Hegel against the conservative reading of Hegel to argue against the idea of the absolute, of dogmatism, of absolute truth, or of a perfect state. Marx began there with the Hegelian dialectic, drawing on that method in an imminent way, precisely because Hegel's thought was so dominant at the time. In a sense, this was doubly imminent, because the dialectical method itself can also be interpreted as a form of immanent critique, at least according to the Frankfurt School. So he was using the method itself within the method because it was dominant, at the same time that he was using a method that was immanent. Marx started with Hegel to meet his audience where his audience was at. He did so not only for methodological reasons, but also strategic reasons, to try to convince people who were steeped in the dominant Hegelian ideology. Marx thus appropriated from Hegel the historical movement or dialectical movement according to which objects, whether ideas or practices, are transformed through contradictions or conflict. He retained the idea of dialectical change and a learning process, but he turned it from an idealist to a materialist project. And Marx accomplished this, arguably, in two stages. First, by using Feuerbach, whose writings had been so well received by thinkers on the left at the time. These were called the young Hegelians or the left Hegelians, Bruno Bauer, Max Stirner, David Strauss, as well as well received by the German artisans in Paris, right? So first by using Feuerbach, but second by going beyond Feuerbach. The first step then was Feuerbach. Feuerbach's writings had accomplished a few things. First, as noted earlier, Feuerbach modeled a way to invert a totalizing, systematic, idealist schema, so as to demonstrate instead the reality of a materialist worldview. The Christian ideals of perfection, he argued, were nothing more than projections of human perfection. The ideals projected onto God were actually human qualities, known best by people themselves. He would write, "Thou believest in love as a divine attribute because thou lovest thyself." This is Feuerbach. "Thou believest that God is a wise, benevolent being because thou knowest nothing better in thyself than benevolence and wisdom. And thou believest that God exists because thou thyself existest, art thyself a subject." Feuerbach entered the subjectivity of his readers to flip their understanding of themselves and their world. And this is what gave rise first to that process of inversion, of creating what Engels called a mirror image. Then Feuerbach centered and valorized those human attributes which were projected onto God but came back onto humans. He was particularly taken by human affection, by love, and the will to power. He developed a new type of materialism grounded on these attributes of humans, writing eloquently about the force of love and affection. Quote, "To will, to love, to think are the highest powers, are the absolute nature of man as man and the basis of his existence." That's Feuerbach in The Essence of Christianity. "Man," he writes, "man exists to think, to love, to will." Feuerbach's prose was uplifting and poetic, almost romantic, like Schiller or Goethe. Here's a passage. "True existence is thinking, loving, willing existence. That alone is true, perfect, divine, which exists for its own sake. But such is love, such is reason, such is will. The divine trinity in man, above the individual man, is the unity of reason, love, will. Reason, will, love are not powers which man possesses, for he is nothing without them. He is what he is only by them. They are the constituent elements of his nature, which he neither has nor makes, the animating, determining, governing powers, divine absolute powers to which he can oppose no resistance." It's not surprising that we still use today the English translation by the novelist and poet George Eliot. That was done in 1854. One can imagine Feuerbach as having completed then the first 90-degree turn. But the full inversion would be a two-step process. First following Feuerbach, and then going beyond him. The second stage involved a critique of Feuerbach, which Marx sketched out in his Thesis on Feuerbach. So, step 2, the critique of Feuerbach. Feuerbach had fallen short of the task for several reasons. According to Engels, there were two main weaknesses to Feuerbach's book. First, it was too literary and romantic, too much of a deification of love, as Engels wrote, and as such, it put literary sentiment above scientific knowledge. Second, and relatedly, it mistook liberation by love for class struggle, or in Engels' words, it put the liberation of mankind by means of love in place of the emancipation of the proletariat through the economic transformation of production. In short, losing itself in the nauseous fine writing and sentimentalizing typified by Herr Karl Grün. In other words, Engels maintained, the lower half of him was materialist, the upper half idealist. An additional weakness, according to Engels, is that Feuerbach ended up discarding the Hegelian system rather than overcoming it in a way that preserved something of it. He discarded Hegel rather than preserving a piece of it, and Marx would achieve that, Engels claimed, through historical materialism. Bloch as well would read in Marx's theses, especially in the sixth thesis, class struggle, writing there that, quote, a class barrier is thus fully noted, and the same barrier which blocked revolutionary activity in Feuerbach's epistemology and now blocks history and society in his anthropology. So Engels would read class struggle when he says that Feuerbach mistook liberation by love for class struggle. Engels would read it into the a true interpretation of Feuerbach, as would Ernst Bloch, and as would as well Althusser, who would read class conflict into the social division. And this is a question and a controversy that Étienne Balibar will probably discuss at the seminar. Now, we could say then that Marx used Feuerbach first to retain some elements of that inversion, but then to push him further. And I think you can see this very clearly in the theses themselves. And so at this point, I'd like to set aside Engels and Althusser and Bloch and other commentators and attempt to retrace Marx's critique of the theses themselves from the theses. And I realize it's somewhat imprudent and possibly already, imprudent or certainly imprudent after so much ink has been spilled to try and offer another reading. But with apologies, let me move forward. Marx argues in the Theses that a central problem with Feuerbach was that his conception of the human was too abstract, perfect, undialectical, unhistorical. And Marx conveys this critique in parts of thesis number 6 and number 7. And so you can hear this critique of Feuerbach's conception of the human as being too abstract in thesis number 6, for instance, when Marx writes that the human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual, right? Or in thesis 7, where he writes that the abstract individual whom Feuerbach analyzes belongs to a particular form of society. Marx's argument here is that Feuerbach's conception of the human remains too abstract and idealist, even though he was bringing it back to earth, right? It remains unearthly. It's not contextualized, historicized, or real. And in the thesis, Marx proposes both a reason, right, an explanation for this, and he fleshes out the consequences. The reasons he offers is epistemological. It's about knowledge. This is the epistemological claim that the only way to know something is through practice. mere contemplation, mere thinking, does not lead to true knowledge. Feuerbach and the old materialists, Marx argues, do not recognize this role of practice, and as a result are unable to properly decipher human essence. His argument, essentially, is that only practical engagement with the world can lead to an understanding and critique of reality. And he draws these oppositions between contemplation on the one hand and activity and practice on the other, contemplation of the object versus kind of subjectively entering and actively working on the world. The contrast between kind of a theoretical attitude and a practical attitude, where he speaks about revolutionary action, about practical critical activity. Marx sets this forth in a number of the theses, including thesis number 1 and number 5, both of which Bloch identifies as being in the cluster of the epistemological group, what he calls perception and activity. So in thesis 1, for instance, Marx writes that the main problem with Feuerbach is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as human sensuous activity practice, not subjectively. Right? He argues in that same thesis number 1 that on Feuerbach's view, practice is conceived and fixed only in its kind of dirty manifestations. Feuerbach does not grasp the significance of revolutionary or practical critical activity, Marx writes. Similarly, in thesis number 5, Marx critiques Feuerbach for not conceiving sensuousness as practical human sensuous activity. Now, the centrality of practice to knowledge means that non-practical questions are purely academic, what Marx calls scholastic. This he emphasizes in the second thesis, where he says that the dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking, which is isolated from practice, is a purely scholastic question. So the explanation has to do with the way in which only through practice can we know. Now, the consequences of not appreciating the importance of practice is that Feuerbach is left with a hollow idea of human essence that leaves us only with abstract, isolated individuals and no social context. As Marx writes in the other part of the thesis number 6, Feuerbach, who doesn't engage in a practical activity of understanding, abstracts from the historical process, he writes, and presupposes an idealist, isolated human individual. Essence, therefore, for Marx writes, can be comprehended only as genus, as an internal, dumb generality, which naturally unites the many individuals. In effect, Marx suggests, Feuerbach offers only a vision of atomistic, uncontextualized individuals who together form a human nature. They are detached from the social context, mere abstractions. At best, the abstract human is placed in an abstract concept of civil society, a concept of civil society that has its roots in Hegel's philosophy of right. As Marx writes in thesis number 9, the highest point attained by contemplative materialism, Feuerbach, in other words, still idealist, is the contemplation of single individuals in civil society. Again, with the term civil society, bürgerlich Gesellschaft, Marx is referring to Hegel's concept of civil society as opposed to the state. In other words, the cultural, social, economic, and personal relations. But again, because Feuerbach's concept of the human is so abstract, it produces an equally abstract concept of civil society. By contrast, a more dialectical, or truly Hegelian, for Marx that is, approach would place this abstract human being in history and in social conflict. And whether he means by this class conflict is a contentious matter. But what he's pointing to is the fact that Feuerbach had remained too wedded to a form of idealism or abstraction. And in order to correct this, Marx returns to Hegelian dialectics to find the contradictions and complexity of social life. Marx argues in the first half of the fourth thesis that the heavenly projection can only be the product of contradictions within the earthly world, hence inserting contradiction, conflict, into the human material realm. Marx then proposes to locate the human in practices in the social context. Thesis 4 states, the fact that the secular basis detaches itself from itself and establishes itself in the clouds as an independent realm. So the fact that, Feuerbach had this idea that the humans project themselves onto the heavens can only be explained by the cleavage and self-contradictions within this secular basis. So the idea is that the only reason, the only explanation for the projection into the divine is the fact that there is conflict and self-contradiction in the earthly world, in the secular basis. And he then says that, and this is where one can imagine the role of class conflict being in the earthly part here, and the separations being projected onto the heaven but coming back to the earthly. And then in thesis number 10, Marx draws the contrast between the standpoint of old materialism, which was the concept of civil society, and the standpoint of the new materialism, which is human society or social humanity, the whole complex and conflicted space of social humanity. All of this leads ultimately to a forward-looking project in the thesis on Feuerbach. And that project is to use practice not only to understand the world, but to change it. Marx states this actually in several theses, most famously, of course, in the 11th thesis, but in others as well. Thesis number 4, thesis number 3, number 8. The foundation of all of this is that humans make their history, which Marx asserts in thesis number 8, where he says, it is men who change circumstances. I'm sorry, this is thesis number 3. It is men who change circumstances, and it is essential to educate the educator himself. Right? There's this idea that men make their history, or humans make their history, and it leads to this point. He writes that the coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity can be conceived and rationally understood only as revolutionizing practice. And in this passage, he again is underscoring the role of practice in creating history and the possibility of revolutionary practice. Thesis number 8, he underscores the prospective power of practice, right? All social life is essentially practical, he says. All mysteries which mislead theory to mysticism find their rational solution in human practice and in the comprehension of this practice. And on this basis, Marx asserts the future-oriented project of changing the world. He does so first in the fourth thesis, where he speaks of the task of destroying in theory and in praxis the abstract idea of the earthly family, and of course, in perhaps the most famous passage of the Thesis on Feuerbach, he contends that philosophers must engage in practice and change the world. Thesis 11, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. One could say that Marx's overarching project operates then at two levels, a methodological and a political level. At the methodological level, it serves to turn Hegel's dialectic on its head, from idealism to materialism. Instead of Hegel's dialectic of the concept of consciousness, of rationality, of the idea leading to perfect self-consciousness and absolute reason, Marx proposes a materialist dialectic involving the transformation of the human world. And then at the political level, it serves to focus the method on the conflicts within human society, or socialized humanity, and to focus our attention on the need to change that. Engels would give all this a historical materialist spin. He referred to the dialectic as the science of the general laws of motion. He would systematize. He would turn it into a science. And from a kind of material dialectic, he would turn it into a historical materialism that would try to decipher the general laws of history. He would write famously, "Thereby, the dialectic of concept itself became merely the conscious reflex of the dialectical motion of the real world, and thus the dialectic of Hegel was turned over, or rather, turned off its head on which it was standing and placed upon its feet." For Engels, Marx turned Hegel's dialectical analysis into the discovery of the laws of motion of history and society, rather than consciousness. In this sense, according to Engels, Marx was able to peel away the conservative aspect of Hegel, the idealism, and retain the revolutionary aspect, the dialectical method. Now, at the seminar, Étienne Balibar is going to share with us both Althusser's structure, philosophical structure and schema for understanding the Theses on Feuerbach, which is this table from a 1961 seminar at the École Normale Supérieure, at which Étienne Balibar was present. It's on the website, so you can download it easily from the website. And it goes through it's Althusser's schema to understand the theses. Étienne Balibar will also describe his own schema, which he calls a simplified topography of concepts organizing the theses on Feuerbach. And again, this too is on the website, so you can download it from the website. He develops here the various concepts, and it's important for Étienne Balibar to refer to concepts, political concepts, which is very important to him. Those are the concepts that are in the Thesis on Feuerbach and that ground it, at the heart of which is what he calls human essence, Wesen. But the other ones being alienation, society, transformation, praxis. Now, I would offer a different schema, which I too will put on the website, so you'll be able to download it. A schema, essentially, where I suggest that the main concept really is praxis throughout the Theses on Feuerbach. Praxis, and I invite you to download the schema, which I'll put up. This one is in French, but I'll put it up in English. The main concept is praxis, which is understood as activity, as practical activity, critical activity, sensuous activity. And everything needs to go through praxis to move from idealism or old materialism to the new materialism in a kind of cyclical pattern. I'll speak later of a spiral, but I think, yes, a spiral, an ongoing spiral that takes us ultimately to the 11th thesis. Everything has to go through the idea of praxis. And so basically, for instance, abstractions for Hegel or intuitions for Feuerbach need to run through practice to give us knowledge so that we can really grasp objects properly. And then they feed our practice that then can transform circumstances or education into historical processes that can transform the duality between religion and the earthly into the contradictions internal to the earthly, so the class conflicts, that can transform isolated individuals in civil society or civil society itself into the idea of social humanity. Again, it's praxis that turns all of these things into social humanity, knowledge, and historical processes, and ultimately that turns interpretation, philosophical interpretation of the world, into transformation of the world, or the transformability of the world and changing the world. The key concept is practice, which is at the source of knowledge, and that transforms all of the different and defective ways of thinking about duality, about individuals, about circumstances, through praxis, into a historical process that takes us to social humanity, fully fleshed out conception of the human, and that ultimately allows us to try to transform the world. Now, how can we actualize all this today? It seems somewhat historical. It almost seems a bit outdated in some respects. The world feels somewhat less idealistic today than it was back then, at least in terms of kind of dominant ways of thinking. How can we actualize this today? Well, our mindset in the West today is shaped by a different, but not entirely dissimilar worldview. I'm speaking here about the mainstream way, the mainstream view, represented, say, in the United States, for instance, by Democrats, centrists, old-fashioned Republicans. We can put aside for the moment, perhaps, Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans on the extreme right, or at the other pole, anyone kind of further left than the DSA, say. And most centrist Democrats and Republicans, most of the normal distribution in the United States, share a faith in political liberalism. Without necessarily voicing all this explicitly, they effectively believe that political liberalism is and should be the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama provocatively said in his book by that name. Now, you'll notice that in this belief about political liberalism, the end of history, there's a similar idea of a learning process. It took the passage from feudalism and monarchy to forms of liberal democracy to put in place a framework of political liberalism. It's viewed as progressive. It represents progress from earlier political institutions, one that is threatened by anti-democratic forces today. And political liberalism, that's this consensus view, rests on the belief that individuals should be free to pursue their own ideals and ambitions so long as they do not get in the way of others doing the same. It puts in place democratic institutions and practices that are intended to safeguard liberal theory, like rights, courts, and enforcement mechanisms. And although an enlightened despot could probably enforce those liberal rules, political liberalism is inextricably tied to the rule of democracy. Of course, democracy with counter-majoritarian checks and balances. Now, political liberalism is paradoxically somewhat systemic and totalizing. In many people's imagination, it goes hand in hand with an economic belief in competitive capitalism and the idea of free markets. It rests on an idea of individual freedom and choice that extends and that tends to exclude as non-liberal or as paternalistic or as forms of collusion, collectively oriented arrangements. Some liberal Democrats would go so far as to say that it excludes forms of socialism. Now, like Hegelian idealism in the 19th century and in Prussia, political liberalism serves to justify the status quo under most presidential administrations in the United States, such as those of Joe Biden, Barack Obama, George Bush, George W. Bush, or George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton. Most presidential administrations, excluding possibly that of Donald Trump, or at least excluding certain aspects of Trump's presidency, such as the Muslim ban or the overturning of Roe versus Wade by a Supreme Court that he stacked. Like Hegelian idealism in the 19th century, political liberalism is systematic and has slight elements of idealism. It is an airtight, systematic schema that excludes foreign elements by characterizing them as irrational, outside the bounds, or illiberal. It's also has a touch of idealism in much less, of course, than German idealism, but it's far more pragmatic in character. But it nevertheless has some elements of idealism, and it rests most importantly on concepts like the rule of law, rights, and the idea of law as hedges. Of course, that was Hobbes's idea, that law are hedges that prevent us from getting in other people's way and allowing us to pursue our path. It elevates the ideal of human freedom and private human action, as long as it doesn't interfere with others' freedom. It abstracts from the material reality of human pursuits and their violence. It prefers to operate at the abstract level than to delve into the material complexity and messiness and violence of people trying to achieve their ambitions and ideals of the good life. Now, this would require, of course, a much longer treatment than I can do in this introductory essay. And so I would refer you, if you're interested, to chapters 9 on the problem of liberalism, or chapters 12 on the problem of violence, or part 2, basically, of my book, A Critique and Praxis. Now, like Hegelian idealism, political liberalism needs to be set straight, turned on its head, because the fact is that the status quo of inequality and precarity is unacceptable. Humans have become far too interdependent today in a way that could not even have been imagined by earlier political thinkers, economists, or social theorists, not even 40 years ago. As a result, most of our inherited liberal political ideas and economic models are now outdated or not up to the task. All of those Enlightenment ideals of individual autonomy, of man mastering nature, of the wealth of nations, all those political, economic, and social theories have proven to be illusory and deceptive, if not perilous, in light of the new reality of complete human interdependence in the face of global warming. And this too would require far more elaboration than I can in this introduction. And here I would refer the reader to the book Cooperation. So that which needs to be turned on its head is no longer, as with Marx, the idealism. Political liberalism today is much more pragmatic than earlier systems. What needs to be inverted is the individualism that is at the core of political liberalism. And there needs to be an inversion from that radical individualism to a notion of the collective. Now, the individualism in political liberalism is the product of a centuries-long philosophical shift reflected in modern political theory and the birth of the social sciences. It traces to Kantian notions of autonomy that crystallize the idea that each person should govern themselves freely by individually consenting to the legal rules established by the state. It traces as well to the English and French traditions of contract theory. It traces to what Benjamin Constant would come to refer to as the liberty of the moderns. Philosophically, the idea of liberty became inextricably linked to the autonomy of the individual, and of course, for the most part, the autonomy of the individual white male property owner, which is, of course, the point of Carol Pateman's book, The Sexual Contract from 1988. But this went hand in hand with the economic idea that private vices make public virtues, right? With the idea that we should just focus on our own individual pursuits and that will benefit the greater good. As the social sciences emerged in the 19th century and developed in the 20th century, this also went hand in hand with the foundation of the social sciences, which was a form of methodological individualism. And this, of course, you can find in rational choice theory, which became dominant in the mid-20th century and still dominates today as a way of thinking about the world through the lens of the individual rational actor. This was accompanied throughout by an anthropologization and a rise of the anthropological question in philosophy, which is, of course, what Michel Foucault would identify and critique in his early writings in the 1950s, as well as in The Order of Things, Les Mots et les Choses, in 1966. Of course, leaving us at the end of that book with the ominous vision. Then one can certainly wager, he writes, he ends the book, that man will be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. Now, my analysis here of the centuries-long shift towards the individual would also require a longer elaboration, but let me leave it there at this point. How can we then address this obsession with the individual, with the rational individual, with the autonomous individual, at this time where the focus on the individual is so detrimental to fighting against global climate change and the threats to humanity? We are so interdependent today. The idea of everyone just pursuing their own individual goals no longer makes any sense. What one individual does on one side of the planet, right, has ripple effects, tornadoes and droughts and floods on the other side of the earth. We can't deal with climate change through the individual. So how do we deal with that obsession with the individual? How do we replace it with the well-being of the collectivity? That, I take it, is our greatest challenge today. The question to continue the analogy would be, who is our Feuerbach today? And perhaps it is here again that Foucault comes back into the picture. Foucault is the one who taught us about the death of man. Perhaps it's not by accident that I referred to him in that famous last line of his book, The Order of Things, Les mots et les choses, in 1966. Foucault and his contemporaries, but perhaps more than his contemporaries, taught us to beware of the abstraction of man, of the individual. It was a theme that ran throughout his work, not just in 1966. It is one that he tilled and worked over and over. At the end of his introduction to Kant's Anthropology in 1959-60, in his early writings on Nietzsche in the 1950s, in La Question anthropologique in 1954 and elsewhere. As Foucault himself noted, it was a theme that Nietzsche inspired with his writings on the death of God. The model for such a critique, Foucault writes in 1960, was given to us more than 50 years ago. The Nietzschean enterprise, he writes, can be understood as at last bringing that proliferation of the question of man to an end. For is not the death of God in effect manifested by a doubly murderous gesture, which, by putting an end to the absolute, is at the same time the cause of the death of man himself? Foucault asked. Yes, of course, it was but a small leap from the death of God to the death of man, one that both Nietzsche and Foucault happily took. The death of man was but a reflection, a mirror image. You will recall the famous passage from The Gay Sciences, Nietzsche's extraordinary book of aphorisms. Perhaps this passage is one of my favorite passages in Nietzsche. I cite it so often. It's a passage about the Buddha. And Nietzsche writes, "After Buddha was dead, they still showed his shadow in a cave for centuries, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way people are, they may still, for millennia, be caves in which they show his shadow. And we must still defeat his shadow as well." I have no doubt that Nietzsche had man in mind, humanism, the sanctification of the individual, when he spoke of God's shadow. Without question, we learned to be anti-humanists with Foucault building on Nietzsche. So perhaps Foucault then started to turn on its head our faith in the individual. Perhaps his book, The Order of Things, played the role of Feuerbach's book, The Essence of Christianity. Like Feuerbach, we might say with Engels, the spell was broken. One must himself have experienced the liberating effect of this book to get an idea of it. And with but a slight edit, we might say, enthusiasm was general. We all became at once Foucauldians. But perhaps we need another turn. Somewhat like Feuerbach, Foucault may have been perhaps a bit too dramatic with the death of man, or infatuated by the death part. Perhaps too taken by the literary or the poetic dimensions, perhaps too fascinated by the abyss, too captivated by the darkness, too dramatic in that he couldn't get beyond the death of man. In his early writings, he was possessed by Nietzsche's line from Beyond Good and Evil. It's paragraph 39. To perish through absolute knowledge could even be part of the fundamental composition of existence. He wrote about that line as in his youth in the 1950s. He would continue to write about that, and the theme would come back in his work throughout the 60s. But perhaps Foucault was too gripped by death and could not see past it. Maybe there was too much of a deification of death, to borrow a term from Engels' critique of Feuerbach. Foucault began to turn man, the individual, on its head, but only 90 degrees. He got rid of the individual, comme à la limite de la mer, un visage de sable. The last line. But he did not signal what might come next, or even point us in a direction. And whenever he did, it was cryptic, poetic, suggestive, but enigmatic at best, like the end of the introduction to Kant's Anthropology that he wrote. After reaching the death of man, tracing it back to Nietzsche, underscoring that it is in the death of man that the death of God is realized. Where did Foucault finally leave us, you may ask? The answer was obscure at best. The trajectory of the question, was ist der Mensch, in the field of philosophy reaches its end in the response which both challenges and disarms it. Der Übermensch. Perhaps Zarathustra's chosen few understood that. Perhaps it was a mirror for us to project onto, right? Der Übermensch. In any event, though, it didn't indicate a material way forward, a next object, however temporary, another turn. In this sense, too, we might say with Engels, the lower half of him was materialist, the upper half idealist. We have to do the rest, then, ourselves. And faced with our crises today, we may have no choice but to replace the perished man with the cooperating collective. With Marx, we may need to think about this in processual terms, not in absolute or dogmatic terms. And with Bloch, we may want to think about this in forward-looking terms, as a series of what he wrote, forwards in the changeable world. If indeed, as Bloch emphasized, Marx wanted the present to rule over the past, it must be a present, as Bloch wrote, together with the horizon within it, the horizon of the future, one that points forward in a transition, not to the end of history, a necessary change to resolve our crises today. Notice that we end here on Marx's 11th thesis. All right, two final thoughts. First, the allusion to 90-degree turns, coupled with the idea that we never arrive at the end of history, may make this feel like a Sisyphean task, not in a bad way, but in an eternal way. But it does not land us eventually in the same place. A series of 90-degree turns don't leave us in the same place. Perhaps one way to think of these gradual turns is the metaphor of revolution in the classical sense, the way the ancients thought about politics, or the stars in the skies as revolving. But maybe, so that we don't end in the same place, instead of revolving in a circular pattern that would land us back at the beginning, we could think of revolving in a spiral that constantly grows and takes us to new places. A bit like the spiral, possibly, in this schema. Second, it would be essential to distinguish the different values underlying the notion of the collective that I am invoking here, and to distinguish them from those underlying a fascist notion, since both can be placed in opposition to individualism. Fascism, insofar as the term is associated with the fasces, that bundle of rods carried by the lictor of ancient Rome, also relies on an idea of the collective, but as a unified bundle of strength in contrast to individual weakness. The values are entirely different. It would be important to differentiate them and develop a radical theory of values. So now we will begin our discussion with Étienne Balibar. Having him accompany us through the series and having him close the final session next May offers a unique opportunity to renew the formative work that Étienne Balibar accomplished with his mentor and teacher, Louis Althusser, and his fellow students and colleagues, Jacques Rancière, Pierre Macheret, and Roger Establet, at their seminar on Marx at the École Normale Supérieure in 1964-65, the seminar that gave rise to the famous collected volume, Reading Capital. It also gives us an opportunity to revisit Étienne Balibar's formative reading of Marx in his groundbreaking book, The Philosophy of Marx. Étienne Balibar has written extensively about the Thesis on Feuerbach and will explain his reasons for starting there at the inaugural seminar of Marx 1313. For now, I will just share with you a brilliant introductory passage from one of Balibar's commentaries on the Thesis. And this is Étienne Balibar speaking. They are widely considered one of the emblematic formularies of Western philosophy, and sometimes compared to other concise texts, such as Parmenides' poem or Wittgenstein's Tractatus, that combine a speculative content of seemingly enigmatic, inexhaustibly richness, with a manifesto-like style of enunciation, apparently signaling a radically new mode of thinking. Some of the best-known aphorisms have achieved a posteriori the same value of a turning point in philosophy, or in our relationship to philosophy, as, for instance, not only Parmenides and Wittgenstein's respective being and thinking are the same, and whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, but also Spinoza's the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things, or Kant's without sensibility no object would be given to us, without understanding no object would be thought. His point, of course, is that Marx's Theses on Feuerbach have left us with one of those concise texts that have been transformative to philosophy, a turning point of philosophy, of our relation to philosophy, and of course, most prominently with the 11th thesis, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. As Balibar notes, given all the ink, sweat, and blood that has been spilled over the theses already, it is both extremely tempting and imprudent to embark on a new commentary. But that is our challenge in this inaugural session. Welcome to Marx 113.